Welcome to But What About Me, a career success podcast dedicated to giving a voice to underrepresented populations, or UPs, and helping each navigate their career to reach their highest potential. This podcast is brought to you by JenniferTardy.com. Glad you are back for another episode of But What About Me. I'm your host, Jennifer Tardy, and I have the pleasure of introducing today's guest, Stephanie Ranno. Now, we already knew that we connected through our experience in recruitment, so it was easy to find common ground. But the moment that she shared her passion and expertise around recruiting people with autism, I knew I had to have her on this show. Now, Stephanie combines her professional passion of recruitment with her personal passion for advancing careers for people on the spectrum or autistics. In this episode, you will hear her dive into many subjects, such as why the conversation about autism and careers is necessary. Stephanie's going to talk about her desires and her hopes around access to a successful career path for her daughter, who happens to be on the spectrum. She's going to talk about some examples of common unconscious biases autistics may have to navigate in order to find gainful employment. And even we dive into the best time for sharing with an employer that you are a person with autism and knowing what accommodations that you may need to request. And we even talk about companies who are leading the way in best practice hiring for this population. Now, who is Stephanie? So Stephanie is the Director of Enterprise Business Development for Torchlight Hire, one of Washington, D.C.'s fastest growing firms in marketing and communications, search, and staffing. Stephanie is focused on helping marketing leaders build talented teams and grow meaningful, progressive careers. Having reviewed thousands of resumes and job descriptions and advised hiring managers and candidates alike through hundreds of searches and placements, she is uniquely qualified to speak and write on what really works in recruitment and talent acquisition strategy. She was recognized as a 2017 Maryland Leading Woman by the Daily Record for professional accomplishment, community involvement, and a commitment to inspiring change. Stephanie tries to pursue an integrated life at home and work. A wife and mother of 3, she believes that a woman can have it all: success in career and family life, as well as in creative and community projects. If you want to see more on Stephanie or Torchlight Hire, visit torchlighthire.com. Now, when you hear Stephanie, you are truly going to see her positivity and passion come out in today's episode. So sit back and enjoy. And if you like what you are hearing, take a screenshot of the podcast and post it to Instagram. And do not forget to tag us at Your Career Success so that we can see it too. Are you ready to get started? Let's go. Stephanie, thank you for coming to the show. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
No problem at all. And so, like many people that I'm meeting, you and I met through a mutual friend. So I'm very excited about Joan. And when you and I had a conversation, we weren't really quite certain of what we were going to talk about until you shared with me something really, really passionate. And we started having a conversation about people with autism and careers. Mm-hmm. And I said, you know what? We've got to talk about this on the show. So usually we name it on this show where we talk specifically about the population or the audience that we're talking to. And in this conversation, we're talking to people who are autistic and their loved ones. And so let's talk about that. Why are we talking about them today? Why is today a good time to talk about them?
Yeah, so thank you again so much for having me on your show. It's quite an honor to be able to talk about 2 things that I'm passionate about, which is recruitment and staffing in the world of careers and helping people identify jobs that that they love. And then the world of autism. So why you and I are talking about it today is because I have a daughter who's 5.5, and she is autistic. And it's funny that you started out saying, like, we want to name the population. And just even that right now, where we are in our world is hard to define, because they're just naming it autistic, or a person with autism, or my daughter who is autistic. It's got controversy behind it. So a lot of folks will say we should talk about people with autism from a person first standpoint. So the person versus the autistic. However, many people that are autistic who will say, well, I want to be identified as autistic, because you can't separate it. It's not something that I get over. It's not, at the core, autism is a developmental disability that has many coexisting issues that can occur with it, mental, emotional, physical. But autism in and of itself, as it's defined by what they call the DSM-5, which is a mental health book, and it came out recently within the last 2 years. It's issues around communication, social interaction, and certain repetitive behaviors. So my daughter, who was diagnosed right before she turned 3, was sort of a classic case of autism. So we were having delayed speech, lack of interaction with family members in a way that was typical from a developing standpoint, and then some repetitive behaviors. So in addition to that, she also has something called sensory processing disorder, and other physical gut health issues and things like that. But I think the reason that we're talking about it too, and the reason I think about it all the time, is because I have worked with hundreds of companies and hundreds of people, and I know that things in and around the interview process, performance reviews, just working within an organization with other team members, some of those, the way that we have our world of work set up is kind of stacked against people with autism or autistics.
And that's how it came up for us. That's how you and I started having this conversation, because you started sharing with me some data around, let's just talk about the data, data on how large of a population we're talking about, and how they're entering the workforce.
For sure. So
eligible. So let's talk about it.
Yeah, no. And it's not funny, but it's interesting as we're talking now, because the CDC just came out within the last couple of months with new numbers. Okay. So if you talked to me a year ago at this time, the numbers would have been 1 in 68 children are diagnosed with autism. The numbers now are 1 in 59. So the reason, and they don't know exactly what the reasons are, but one of the overarching reasons is there is more diagnosis in rural populations. It's becoming more known. There has been that change in the diagnostic structure. So as opposed to having an Asperger's diagnosis, an autism diagnosis, another one that was called pervasive development disorder, non-described, PDD-NOS, it's all on a spectrum now. And then even urban populations are getting more access to early intervention and early assessment. So whether it's, whether there is an overall increase, the numbers are increasing. The numbers have increased. So 1 in 59. And then the other number that's so important to remember is about 50,000 students, 50,000 young people age out of the school system every year at age 18, and the services then become lessened for those populations. So right now, my daughter's in the school system. She's been in the school system since she was 3. We receive services in the school system. We ourselves, she's in 14 hours of therapy a week through our own insurance in our home, to be able to, again, propel her forward and give her as much therapy and support as she needs. But once you hit 18, there are, and we can talk about it as we get through, there are other programs for parents and for those students as they're exiting out. But the reality is, and these are some other numbers that are fairly shocking, is that between 70 and 90% of those that are eligible to work and want to work and can work, they're not working. They're underemployed or underemployed, 70 to 90%.
Wow, that's a large number.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, as we're talking about your daughter from a career perspective, and someone who loves her, obviously, what is your
Right.
desire for her from a career perspective, and what do you hope her career experience looks like in a perfect world?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I think, work helps give us a place and a meaning in our world. And so anyone who can, and sometimes people can't work, right? Physically, maybe mentally or emotionally, maybe they have other focuses from a working outside the home perspective. Maybe they're taking care of a loved one or something and they're not able to. But if someone wants to work and has the abilities to do that, there is meaning that's given to that person's life. Yes, they can become more self-sufficient and confident and sort of, I don't know the money numbers, but it's astronomical, like just the costs of supporting folks that have autism. So if they can help support themselves, it's not just a good economic reason to do it, but it gives you a sense of place and purpose and worth. I'll give you a little example of what I foresee. So last week, for the first time, my daughter, she knows her alphabet, but she wrote on a piece of paper, unprompted, D-A-D. And she went up to my husband and she put the paper under him and she said, Dad. And then she wrote M-O-M. And she came under me and she wrote Mom. And then she wanted to know how to spell, and she did it all on her own, each of her siblings' names. So Colin and Julian, and then Nana lives with us. We're a blended family. So, and I could see it's not just about that she can write those words. Her face when she accomplished that task, I could see this confidence. I could see this, sense of worth in that what she did was good, and she'd been working on it and she accomplished it and she wanted to show it to us. Now that's a little example of a 5.5-year-old, but the way that she sees problems, the way she experiences the world, all of these ways that autism is kind of gifted her. And I'm not saying she's savant. That's the thing we could maybe talk about later too, but she sees problems differently and she solves them differently. And isn't that what our work world wants? People that see things differently, that come to the table with an innovative approach. And that's what I think they bring, and how our communities and our companies and our world can be better.
What concerns do you have for her? So as you're thinking about, I know she's, you said 5 years old, right? Mm-hmm. So I know it's a little far down the line, but what concerns do you have for her as you begin thinking about her going into employment?
So I think overall, and I've been in recruitment now for 13 years. So I work.
I love that we're having this conversation because we're able to talk about both ends of the spectrum. You fully understand the recruitment world. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I love it. Jump in. I can just chat all day. So I've been in recruitment in the agency world for 13 years. I currently work for a company called Torchlight, woman-owned, awesome, work in marketing communications. And I've worked with candidates and I've worked with clients through the interview process. And I will tell you, whether you're autistic or whether you're introverted in a way, the recruitment process is stacked against you. The interview process is stacked against you. If you have trouble if you get social anxiety, if you have trouble communicating socially, if you have maybe a tic or a repetitive behavior, if you struggle again with social communications and maybe reading people's emotions and expressing your emotions in a way that would be considered, typical. A lot of people talk about culture fit and gut and those kind of things. And they are companies still are making the majority, a larger percentage of their hiring decision. If you check the box on skill set, you're going to win out if you can socially relate to that person better. And if you can communicate, if you're highly verbal, right? So I think that's stacked against someone who is autistic right out of the gate. I think once you get into an organization, as you go through and there are, stressors occur, or you're working in a team, those can sometimes, you can do things that might be considered odd or not normal, and they are normal for how you're experiencing the world or what you need. And so that can also prevent you from moving up in an organization, prevent you from being accessed for teams. Maybe it even has you getting let go, getting fired from a job because, from a cultural perspective, you didn't fit. So I think it's not only a barrier to get into the position, but it's also a barrier to stay in that role. And one of the interesting things that I found is those companies that have an autism at work, or a program that is around neurodiversity, it's a term you'll hear a lot, when they have the right type of program, buddy system, have set up the right type of training for both their staff as well as the autistics that are joining their team, they have huge levels of loyalty. They retain these folks. And it's not just in the areas that you might consider, where behind the scenes, not customer facing. Those aren't, I don't like those kind of barriers and boundaries too. Like, oh, if you're autistic, you can do something with math, you can do developing and coding, but you can't work front lines with customers. Well, no, you can. They can.
That makes sense. And what about the person who's listening to this and is saying, that's me, that's what I've been experiencing, whether they're looking for a job or whether they're employed right now and they're facing these barriers. So you're talking about me, what would you say to them as some potential solutions? Where can they reach for support so that they can have career success?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It depends on what region you're in. There's one organization called the ARC, ARC. They're a national organization that helps with developmental and intellectual disability, and they help with job placement. And so training and job placement, I know there are a number of ARC chapters here in Maryland, but they're all over the country. So that's one place you could go. I've also seen, there's a lot on the West Coast. I've also seen some organizations, again, popping up on the West Coast, a couple up in New York, that are training both for the individual, but also for the company. I think also, looking within your own network to find folks that you can connect with, that can make introductions for you, as opposed to kind of going in cold to a job opportunity. So, some people may say, well, take me on my work, right? But the reality is, again, if you know that the interview process is going to run one way, then you need to be able to both practice. My daughter is very good with scripts. And so scripting, it's called scripting, or echolalia is another term. Okay. And so she, if I were to give her a script about how she could go into an interview process, if we practice that for a while, she could probably get pretty good with it. Now, there may be other things that are difficult for her to make eye contact, or maybe even maintain the attention that she needs for that amount of time. But again, she's 5, so we've got some time. But I think there's a combination of, and I struggle with this as a mother and as someone in this profession, to say, how much am I going to change her, and how much do I want the world to change for her?
I like that.
Because I want her to fit in. Everybody wants their kids to fit in, but I don't want to lessen her gifts and her perspective on the world. I still want her to be her. I still want her to have that. And I think she still will. But when we talk about the therapies that you're doing, and to get your kids ready, or to get your young adults ready to go into the workforce, there are things you need to do. There are ways you need to work. There are ways you need to approach problems in the workforce that, that might be tough or difficult. I guess one of the things I'm struggling with is, so people are like, well, don't tell them, right? Don't tell someone that you may be on the autism spectrum. And I'm like, well, it's not like it's an excuse. It's who you are. It's how you experience the world. So
What do you recommend? Do you recommend to say it or to tell them or to?
So you probably know better than me around protected class, right? So if somebody has a disability, companies do want to know that because they don't want to discriminate against those people, and they want to make the right necessary accommodations for those people that might need it. So, and I know for many organizations, they have programs that specifically target, and they want to hit certain numbers. They want to hit, so, being able to say and being able to access, you might not even know. So I always recommend, I'm very transparent, and maybe I'm a little too transparent with how my work and my life, but they're kind of all integrated.
Yeah.
So I say, yes, I would share it. I would share it, and I would share it in an appropriate way with, someone within the HR team. And then they'll guide you as to how to share it with either the people the hiring managers you're interviewing with, and they will also guide in how we, message that out to the team.
Do you have a recommendation of, is there a certain point in the recruiting process that it should be shared? So I like that you mentioned share it with someone in HR. And I also love that you mentioned that there are programs that are specifically looking for people who are on the spectrum, right?
Yep.
And whenever there's a program for something at an organization, I am a huge proponent of go through the program, because
Yep.
it's way more visibility through the program, just by being who you are. And that's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful way of being embraced, no matter the race, religion, disability, anything like that. So back to my original question, now that you're in the interviewing process, is there a good place and a good time in the interviewing process to disclose that information?
So again, I'm kind of an early sharer. I think I'm on this podcast because I early shared with you.
Okay, good.
But I would say, to your point, and I can share a couple of organizations that specifically do have programs that are for folks that are autistic. But I would say early, you're normally going to be talking to a recruiter or someone in HR at the outset anyway. So, once you've gotten through why you're a good fit for it, again, I think the more you can utilize your network as opposed to maybe going in cold, the more someone can put your resume in front of a recruiter or a hiring manager, the better you are, because you already have an implied reference, an implied referral in who you are by coming from someone within the network. And, I think people sometimes are reticent about asking for an introduction. And it's, I always recommend, versus going through applicant tracking systems and all of the, doing your quick applies on LinkedIn, doing all those things. You want to go to a person. You want to connect. Who is the closest connection? And maybe it's not just one, maybe there are 2 or 3 people. Who's the closest connection within your network? Could be someone you went to school with, could be a friend's parent, could be someone that, went to your school, is an alumna of your school. You want to get someone to take your resume and put it in front of a person and say, this you should talk to this person.
Got it. So you were mentioning a second ago about, there's some employers and there are some programs. Any employers or programs that you'd like to mention
Sure.
that career seekers should know about that are doing it well?
Yeah. So there is a program called Autism at Work. And if you just Google autism at work, you will see that in over the last 3 years, there's been a summit of more than 150 companies that meet out on Microsoft's campus in Washington State. And they convene and they talk about how do we increase the number of autistic people within our working population. So, and you can see JP Morgan, some of the big guys, SAP, and I'll talk about SAP in a second because they were kind of the ones that ran first down the route of creating this neurodiversity in their organization. They actually have a goal to get to 1%, which is the overall global population of people with autism in their workforce. Now, I do like numbers and looking at numbers to see how people are doing. So they established this back in, I think, 2013, 2014, this Autism at Work program. Currently within, I think, either 617 or now, they have about 150 people that are employed with autism in their organization.
Awesome.
It's awesome, and it's well below their target. So their target is 1%. They have 80,000 employees. So that, I know. I hope that's right. I Wikipedia'd it.
Right.
But they have about 80,000. So to get to that 1% parity of 800 people, and they have 140, 150 by 2020, it's not going to happen. I mean, it's 2018, almost the end of 2018.
Right.
So the reason I bring that up, and it's awesome that they have that, I think they have the largest number. But it's such a larger number. Like to get to a real impact on that 70 to 90%, it can't just be SAP, Microsoft, the big guys. I mean, we all know that small business and mid-sized business is where a lot of the growth in our economy comes from. So this needs to be something, if there's going to be an impact in communities, it needs to be something that happens, yes, led by PwC and IBM and SAP and gosh, there's others. I just want to look at my little cheat sheet real quick. JP Morgan, Ford, Ernst & Young, Microsoft. Those are some of the big guys. They can kind of pave the way by putting in these larger programs, but then the learnings, like how are they actually doing it? If you go to Autism Speaks, if you go to the Autism at Work page, there are kits that companies can utilize to actually put a similar program in place. How do we do the interviewing? How do we, develop a buddy system? How do we make sure that, our employee population and our autistic employed population are succeeding? So there are resources.
Well, let me ask you, the same site that we were talking about just now that creates autism kits for employers, this site, and I'll put all the details in the detail section in case anyone wants to know where to find it, but this site can a job seeker also go to this site to see what employers have autism kits or tools or things like that?
Yes. So one of the things that I wanted to do in preparation for because, I always want to make sure I've got, my ducks in a row. So I made sure that I was doing some additional research before we were chatting. But if you go on to any of these particularly large companies' websites, they will share with you like how to apply, what jobs. They've even sometimes targeted certain jobs that would be good for the autistic population. And then tips about this is what your interview process is going to look like. This is what the application process looks like. Oftentimes they'll do cohorts. So they'll bring a group of people in at the same time, which is great because then you've got, a group of people that you're going through to get, going through the process together. So, again, one of the things I'd love to mention about that SAP program and in the positive, and I think it's all of it, any of it is positive. No matter the daunting numbers. But the head of their program, he came out and said, I had expected to get a lot of people from certain areas, of work. So developers or analysts. And he said, I got applications from lawyers and salespeople and customer service people. So that goes to show you, again, it's a spectrum. So if you are autistic, you could be a sales manager. There's nothing that says you have to be pigeonholed into certain types of jobs. I think there is a misnomer when you think about Rain Man or savants in autism. Yes, there is a higher percentage of savants, autistic savants, than in the general population, but it's still not the majority. And I think the other thing to remember too is there are often a much increased level of coexisting conditions. So there could be seizure disorders. There could be anxiety and depression that occurs. ADHD, physical, again, I mentioned seizures, but gut health issues. For my daughter, she's on a gluten-free, dairy-free diet. So to potentially help with some of the symptoms.
That's a good diet in general.
Yeah.
So going back to something that you had mentioned a second ago, because you mentioned it twice, and I love hearing, I'd love to hear more about it, but the high unemployment rate. So my first thought would be, okay, it's probably a higher unemployment rate because of the barriers to entry. Are you able to speak to any of the other reasons for why the unemployment rate could be so high? Could it be, for instance, that that there aren't enough programs that are helping people with autism begin to think and plan their career choices out, think about and plan their career choices out, or are there other barriers?
Yeah, no, I think you've sort of hit a couple of things, whether it's just tough to get through the interview process, or whether you're so focused. I mean, as a parent who has a child with autism, you're kind of, you straddle this world of IEPs and therapies, and you straddle this world of like, you're in the moment focused on getting them to like the next milestone. But how often are you thinking about, right now at 5.5, what's after high school? Like, will my child go to college? There are certain college programs that are set up for, to be able to support autistics. So, but still, these are, they're contained communities. And so then once you come home, it can be daunting for anyone, right? That comes home from college. And particularly for many folks with autism, a change in structure and a change in routine is really difficult. The transition period is really difficult. So a sense of routine and a sense of order is more comfortable for them. So if you're in like these transition phases of your life without the right support system, it can be really tough. And so I think it's also the right access and knowing, like, do I share? Do I not share? Do I get a coach? Is there a coach that I can get that's specific to help me transition? When you think too about the spectrum, those that are most severe on the spectrum have more services available to them through the federal government, through the state governments, through different programs. Those that are much higher on the spectrum, I don't know which way the spectrum goes.
I get that.
They're all up here, right? Those that are higher on the spectrum, do I share it? Because, from an intellectual capability standpoint and maybe from a communication standpoint, I am on par, but from a social, emotional, or from a behavioral sensory processing place, it's really tough for me. So I think the more that we talk about it, the more that we talk about it with families and prepare them up, either there's a program that takes you out from the school system and gets you ready, or a program, from the school system, high school to college, or even high school into the workforce. There could be that function too, is you don't have to go to college and get a college degree. Maybe you want to go straight into the workforce after high school.
Okay. And I'm curious, if, let's say someone's listening to this episode and they are a loved one, whether they're a friend or a family member, of a person with autism, and they're saying, well, what I want to help. Right. I want to help to make sure that this person that I love has all of the options that they want for their career. What can I do, Stephanie? What would you say to them?
I would say, first and foremost, is to have high expectations for that person in your life. I think I'm reminded of that often through my own, sometimes I have an 8-year-old, and he asked me at one point about, will Emmy, when she has a child, will Emmy's child have autism? And it was the first time that I was faced with my own feelings of, or my own, it was sort of put right up against me from my 8-year-old. I had never considered her having the ability to necessarily grow up, get married, and have a kid. And I was like, it hit me that sometimes we don't expect as much, and we should. So I'd say if you're a loved one, expect greatness, expect winning and ability and opportunity. Expect that, because I think if you expect it, then you'll seek it out. And then, like I would say to anyone, you have to use your network. So I'll give you a little story. I shared pretty openly this past April. April is Autism Awareness Month, global, and there's World Autism Day early on in April. I forget the day. Gosh, it's like April 2nd or 5th, one of the early days in April. So I decided to share every day on Facebook. I was going to do it every day on Facebook and LinkedIn, but it just got too daunting. So I shared regularly on LinkedIn. But again, I'm pretty open. So I had some former clients that were friends on Facebook. I have, many friends that are on LinkedIn. But I was amazed at former clients, candidates I had worked with years ago, people that were within my extended network that reached out and said, I have a nephew who's 18, who's autistic. My son was just diagnosed high functioning autism. Like, it was overwhelming. And just for them to see it being talked about on a platform like LinkedIn, it was, and what I said, they said, what can I do? And so I sent them a couple of resources. So ask your network if for help, for support, for guidance, and ask your work. If you are a relative of someone that is on the spectrum and you work for any company, but especially for those that are larger, ask them if they have a program for neurodiversity, for autism in the workplace. Because if we don't ask, then we don't know. And I think that for me is the number one kind of takeaway from sharing, is just in my sharing, so many people came back and asked me for help. And of course, I was happy to help in any way.
And even just your response there just gives me some great ideas. My godson is on the spectrum. And so it gives me, I don't know why I didn't mention it to you when we were on our phone call, Stephanie.
Yeah.
But it gives me some great perspective on what I can do on my end too. So this conversation has definitely been eye-opening, and it wouldn't surprise me if there's a need or a demand to bring you back on the podcast. I do want to, we had talked a second before about employment support. Were you able to share everything that you wanted to share by way of employment support, or did you have other things that you wanted to share?
So I would say a couple of good websites again are the ARC and Autism Speaks. There's also an organization in this area, I think it might be national, but Pathfinders for Autism. And, really those organizations can kind of guide you with other services and support services. But, I think for me, the biggest thing is just raising awareness around the gifts of this population on the client side, and for those that are in the population or those loved ones that have someone that is in the autistic population, to realize that, the more asking that you can do early, the more preparation that you can give to someone, and then, the network that you build around yourself, the better off you're going to be in landing that first opportunity, and then allowing that to kind of help grow out your career. The other final thing too is I went to a conference earlier this year, Temple Grandin. She's one of probably the most famous autistic person. There was a movie made about Temple Grandin. She has multiple advanced degrees. She's a PhD in, I think, large animal study. I don't know what it's called, but she's very vocal about, pushing yourself, if you're an autistic, or if you're a loved one, pushing that family member to expand their abilities, and especially from a very young age. But what was really interesting was there was someone else that spoke at the conference, and she wasn't diagnosed until she was in her late 50s. And she too, yes, and she too had a very advanced degrees in her career path, but she had always struggled with relationships. She had always struggled with her perspective of the world, and in her mid 50s was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. I will say one more kind of final number point is it's much more common for boys to be diagnosed than girls, and it's much more common for girls to go to actually have more communications or be able to mimic socially than it is for boys on the spectrum. They don't quite know why that is, but it is. So if you think about, an even smaller population or audience that we can talk to is autistic women, because it's just a little more rare, and the services and the support should have some difference to it. Mm-hmm. But I say that only to say that you might be sitting there and you're 45 or 50, mm-hmm. and you struggled with certain aspects of work that relate to, and you don't know why. Maybe it makes sense to go out and have a conversation with a professional, because, and I can share with you her name. Her name is Anita. I can't remember her last name, but I can give you her name afterwards. Perfect. But looking at her story, there may be people out there that are really struggling with why they're having trouble socially and with communications and behaviorally in the workplace. And it might not be something that they have ever considered.
Wow. That's a great point, and a great way to wrap up the show on a really good point. I hadn't considered that, and even when you were saying, being diagnosed in your 40s and 50s, it makes sense. Yeah. So, if people are looking for you, where can they find you, and what are you up to over there? What's going on in your world, Stephanie?
Right now, at this very moment.
In general.
I just finished up an RFP response, or my portion of an RFP. No, that's what I was doing right before we got on the call. So I'm on LinkedIn, and I am very open on LinkedIn. I'm on it every day. So feel free to connect with me. Feel free to message me, email me. That's one way. I can give you my email if you want, if people wanted to email me.
I can put it in the details section too.
Great, perfect. So people can email me. Yes, I'm very open to helping folks. It's kind of like, I think my calling is to support people in their life's work, and making sure they have that career.
I think you have a great calling there as well too. So I am going to close the show with you the same way I do with all of our other wonderful guests, and it's with flash questions. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions, and I want to know the first thing that comes to mind for you. No, okay. Stephanie. Okay. Okay. So the first question is, it's never too late to
ask for help.
Number 2, I get inspired by
people like you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And last question, career success means
having opportunity to do work that you're meant to do.
That is awesome. Having an opportunity to do that work. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. You've been a wonderful guest with a beautiful passion, and we appreciate you.
Thank you. This has been really lovely, and I'm happy to, continue the conversation if people find it, helpful and of interest.
I hope you enjoyed today's show. Be sure to tune in next week, because we have so much more in store for you. Until next time, keep going, keep growing, and keep glowing.